that person just said, we're recording this session so that we can share it on the Participatory Grantmaking Community of Practice website and YouTube channel. If you don't want to have your face recorded, please switch your camera off and take your name off of your Zoom profile. I'm Natasha, and I'm bringing the session together as part of the Participatory Grantmaking Community of Practice, and it's something I've been really excited for us to talk about for a while. So I'm glad to see other people are excited and really interested to hear what everyone's going to say on it today. I'm one of the volunteers of the Participatory Grantmaking Community of Practice, and today Elena and Millie are both joining to help with tech and to shout at me when I do things wrong. Just by way of introduction, I'm just going to introduce everyone to the Community of Practice and what we're working on before we get going. The Participatory Grantmaking Community of Practice started 2.5 years ago, and now there's 903 of us in this community, all interested in talking about participatory grantmaking, promoting participatory grantmaking and developing it as a practice. There are lots of useful things that you can get from the community. If you visit the website, there's a whole pile of resources on there, information about upcoming events, and some more on that in a second. You can also join the Google group and the Slack group where you can ask questions, find out what other people are asking. It's a very good space for sharing publications that are going on. And then once a month, there are peer support sessions that we call Tuesday Club and Thursday Club, because they happen on Tuesdays and Thursdays, as the name might indicate, but at different times of the day that suit different time zones. And then a monthly deep dive, and then the YouTube channel where things are recorded and you can go back. And it really is worthwhile eating your lunch whilst watching that YouTube channel, because there's so much interesting information in there. We're evolving how the community of practice is governed and are introducing the idea of an accountability circle, which 19 people have put themselves forward for. And they will be, well, as the name indicates, there'll be a group of people that will hold the Participatory Grantmaking Community of Practice to account. If you're interested in joining one of the other circles or really wish you hadn't let the opportunity to join the accountability circle pass you by, then you can drop me a note in the chat or get in touch with us via the website or message us on Twitter. Really, any of the ways will do. But there's also a programs circle, a finance circle, a comms circle, a getting shit done circle, and a governance circle. So there's lots of different ways that you can come and join and be part of organising this work as well as learning here. Things that are coming up, there's a Tuesday session on the 5th of July. The next Thursday club is the 7th of July. And I'm really, really looking forward to participatory grantmaking and the community and how it builds community, and its impact on community movement building, which is in July as well. Feel free to follow us on Twitter. And if you've got comments you want to make during this session on social medias, then please do crack on. What we ask of the community is that you come and be involved in some way of giving back. This is an entirely free programme that is run by volunteers. So if you want to get involved in blogging, speaking, hosting, writing, sharing or volunteering, let us know. And in return, you get, well, what we hope is really useful community of practice. Today, we're going to talk about the tensions of fundraising for participatory grant making. And I know that not all participatory grant makers are fundraising, but those of us that are, that money has to come from somewhere. And I think something that we talk about a lot is that, well, for starters, that the speed in which people are joining this community, for example, and talking and blogging and tweeting about participatory grant making does not always match the speed at which people are giving to participatory grant making. And where people are giving to participatory grant making, is it all right to take money for participatory grant making at any costs? And it's something I certainly don't have answers to any of those questions, but I know our speakers have lots of interesting things they can talk about it, and I hope they can solve them for me. So we're going to hear from Sadaf Shallwani, who's from the Firelight Foundation, Paul-Gilbert Colletaz, who's from the Red Umbrella Fund, and Yodit Tesfamariam, who I'm really pleased to say is my colleague at Camden Giving. So I will stop talking and hand over to Sadaf.
Thank you. So Natasha mentioned, my name is Sadaf Shallwani, and I am the Director of Programs and Learning at Firelight Foundation. And thanks so much for inviting me to join this conversation. I'm so eager to learn with everyone here and just to engage with these really tough questions. Let me start by giving a little bit of background to Firelight. So Firelight was established in late 99, early 2000 by Carrie Olson and David Katz, who were seeking to respond to the needs of children affected by HIV/AIDS and poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. And they were seeking to support community-based organizations and community solutions based on the evidence, pervasive evidence that children are best cared for in families and in their own communities, rather than in institutions or by outsiders. And so Firelight has evolved a lot since then, but throughout our history, that's been the underlying foundation of our work, that communities and community-led solutions are critical, especially when it comes to the lives and the experiences and the outcomes of children, youth, and families, especially the most vulnerable. Over time, we've moved from being a private foundation to being a public multi-donor fund. And this means that for the last 10 years or so, we've primarily done our work by raising funds from major foundations, family foundations, philanthropists, in order to fulfill our mission. And that mission continues to be about funding, supporting, and strengthening community-based organizations in Eastern and Southern Africa that are especially rooted in and responsive to their own communities and are working with their communities to improve outcomes for children and families. I think what's really defining about Firelight's approach, especially over the last few years, is our commitment to community-driven systems change. And community-driven systems change, we define it as an approach to development, to social change, that emphasizes the insight, the leadership, and the ownership of the people who are actually living with and experiencing the issues at the community level, and their work to create lasting change in systems and root causes that underlie those issues. So what that means in our day-to-day work is that we work with community-based organizations. We provide grants, capacity support, and communities of practice for at least 5 to 7 years. And we support them extensively to work with their communities, to build community agency and capacity, to determine community agendas, to understand and analyze the issues, the root causes, the systems underlying those issues, and then to actually design and carry out community-driven actions to effect change. In order to do this, we've developed systems and practices at our organization that that sort of support community agency and ownership, and that focus on systems change. So as an example, I'll give you a couple of examples. We always provide funding and support for a learning and planning period, even before an organization prepares a proposal. So during this period, the organization, the community organization, has time, funds, as well as support and a community of practice to engage deeply with different stakeholder groups, from community leaders and government officials to families and even children themselves, to understand the issues facing them, to analyze the root causes and systems, and then to work with these community stakeholders to develop a collective action plan in which the CBO, the grantee, is only one actor of many. So in this way, the idea is that the CBO's involvement and Firelight's involvement are small, but sometimes catalytic contribution to a change ownership that's actually owned by a larger collective of community stakeholders, and is much beyond any agenda or parameters that we can bring in. We also support CBOs to work with their communities to develop their own vision, their own long-term goals, their proposed pathways to change, and based on those, to start thinking about ways in which they might assess success or progress. Sometimes this will look like a baseline study, sometimes it will look like a qualitative inquiry, but what's consistent is that the process is completely owned and driven by the CBO and the community. They're the ones who determine what success looks like, what progress looks like, what indicators they want to track, when and how they want to course correct based on what they're seeing. We do facilitate technical support and guidance because for many communities, this will be the first time that they've had the opportunity to develop their own learning and evaluation goals and systems. And as I said before, because we seek to support change in systems and root causes, we recognize that it's happening gradually in nonlinear ways. So we seek to provide longer term funding support and facilitate responsive and sometimes non-traditional ways of grant making, capacity strengthening, and evaluation. So all of this is the reason we're here and part of this conversation. We are not, in honesty, a participatory grant maker, but because we're committed to community agendas, in a sector that's usually driven by donor agendas. We find ourselves grappling with many of the same tensions and complexities that are faced by more traditional participatory grant makers, not traditional, but more progressive participatory grant makers. Question around how do you get funders to relinquish control? How do you get donors on board with funding the community's agenda when it might not be aligned with their agenda? How do you establish trust as well as space for failures? And how do you fundamentally shape a relationship and a sector that's founded on solidarity rather than charity and neocolonialism? So for us, maybe the core tension that I'll start with that bleeds across so many other tensions that we navigate is, who sets the agenda for a change process? As we all know, funders more often than not come to the table with a predetermined agenda. Sometimes this might be a very wide and flexible strategic direction, but sometimes it's a specific focus area and a firm set of parameters. Oftentimes, the funder's agenda is at odds with what communities would define as their own core needs and priorities. It's not to say that the issues that the funders come with are irrelevant to the community, but if the community were truly to map out what they need and what they want to focus on, it would probably not be exactly what the funder has prioritized. But the dynamic where communities and CBOs are often reliant on donor funding means that local organizations and communities are often compelled to change their work and their actions based on these interests and sometimes changing whims of donors around the world, rather than responding to their own community needs and becoming the strong civil society that many communities and organizations would benefit from in the long term. The dynamic also presumes that funders know better than communities what they need and what they should focus on, or that it's more important to focus on what the funder needs than what the community needs. I think everyone here agrees with that. So how do we navigate it at Firelight? And to be honest, most funders do still come to Firelight with an agenda. So what we do is, first, we're completely transparent with the funder about Firelight's commitment to community-driven systems change. This means that when a funder starts conversations with us, they know who we are and how we work. It also means that we don't submit to the funder a proposal with a predetermined set of activities and outcomes, but we provide a framework or plan for how we will work with community organizations and support them to surface and respond to community needs and priorities. We also do give some indicators of the kind of change outcomes we might be working on, but those outcomes will be things like community power, community agency, which of course, will be very subjectively determined at a community level. Even then, we often work with grant officers or program officers who they themselves agree with us, but they're bound by a foundation strategy or board of trustees to fund in a particular way. So what we do with the officer then is work to develop a systems understanding of the particular issue area, which helps them to expand their agenda to be more wide, broad, and flexible. So for example, a funder may have an interest in early childhood development, but we work with the officer, the project officer, to unpack what actually affects the different dimensions of early childhood development at the community level. And it quickly becomes clear that it's interrelated with pretty much everything from poverty to early marriage to gender norms to climate change. So then a thematic area like early childhood development becomes an entry point or a starting point for a discussion. But the community learning and mapping period actually ends up surfacing core underlying issues that affect not just early childhood development, but many other issues as well. So that's exactly what happens. We might use the funder's interest as an entry point, assuming that the funder has the flexibility in their agenda to actually go quite broad beyond that. We're also very transparent with our community partners about what parameters we're working with. We don't try to hide things. We come transparently to the table and try to operate in this relationship of honesty with our partners at the community level so that they can also make informed decisions about whether and to what extent they want to accept these funds and what support they'd like from Firelight in navigating that relationship. I realized that maybe I'll just give one other example of how we work with funders who have specific parameters, and then I'll hand it over to my colleagues. Sometimes we'll find we're working with funders who have stricter parameters around what they will or will not fund. And in some cases, their parameters or even just their top-down approach means that we won't work with them. And there have been times when we have not engaged further with funders. But in many cases, what we try to do is work with the funder to find a strategic way to engage with them despite those parameters that they have. So for example, in some cases, it might be about Firelight, translating, filtering, or packaging what's happening in the community to help the funder relate it to their agenda and their goals. So in the case of early childhood development and our partners working on poverty alleviation, we show the linkages to early childhood development for the funder. In other more difficult cases, a funder may only want to fund purely education programs or only services and not advocacy, or they're only willing to commit funding for 1 or 2 years when we know that change takes much longer than that. These we navigate on a case-by-case basis, and in situations where we think the benefits of getting the funds to communities outweigh the costs, what we do is we use the funding for more restrictive funders to complement funds from other more progressive donors. So for example, if we have a very progressive funder who's very open and flexible around what can be funded, that would create the core funding for one of our clusters of CBOs. And then another funder who maybe wants to provide funding for direct services, we would target that funding in very strategic ways to certain activities without the communities or CBOs really being bothered. So what we try to do is take these different pieces of a puzzle and kind of put it together to create a whole where we're dealing with the messiness on our end, but what our partners experience is a sort of holistic and streamlined, consistent set of funding for 5 to 7 years that enables them to be responsive and strategic to mobilize community-driven systems change. We do the same with managing reporting requirements or monitoring requirements from funders. We try to be the buffer so that most of the work and the load falls on us to navigate those relationships, those requirements, and that our partners are actually just more able to focus on the work that they're doing. I'll pause there and hand it over to my colleagues because I have a lot more to say, and I'm sure there'll be opportunities elsewhere.
Thanks, Sadaf. My secret plan of putting on this session so that I can get loads of top tips that are helpful to me is already paying off. I love the idea of having a sort of donor message that this is how we work with communities rather than these are the outcomes you can expect to see. It's really exciting. We're hoping at the end that we might have some time for some questions. So we'll just move through the speakers now and save questions for the end. And I'll pass on to Paul-Gilbert.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My first name is Paul-Gilbert. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very pleased for the opportunity for Red Umbrella Fund to share its knowledge. It's also my last call of the working week, which makes me particularly excited. I'm turning 32 next week, so now I need glasses to read my notes. So I'm going to put my glasses. Before I speak about the 3 points that I wanted to share with you on Red Umbrella Fund's challenges in fundraising for its participatory grant making, I believe you need to know a little bit more about me, where I come from, and a little bit more about Red Umbrella Fund and where it comes from. My first name is Paul-Gilbert. You can probably tell from that I am French. I live in France. I work as coordinator of Red Umbrella Fund, and besides this, I've also worked as a sex worker for more than 10 years now. Sex work has allowed me to study, to meet wonderful colleagues and people who are mothers, sisters, sons. But the laws surrounding sex work also put me in dangerous situations sometimes. Red Umbrella Fund is an intermediary, participatory, global funder. It's a global fund for and by sex workers. And I wanted to start by saying that there's been some progress recently. So last year, Red Umbrella Fund disbursed 935,000 euros in 2-year core flexible grants to sex worker-led organizations around the world. That was the highest amount ever granted in 1 year by Red Umbrella Fund. This year, we hope to disburse more than 1 million euros in 2-year core flexible grant. However, some factors also make me temper that numbers. Red Umbrella Fund is the second biggest funder for sex workers' rights in the world. We are 3.5 full-time staff equivalent. That tells you where we are. So for this talk, I wanted to focus on the challenge we have faced in fundraising for our participatory grant-making mechanism. And there are 3 that came to mind. The first one was the growing interest in participatory grant-making. That is a great thing, but it often doesn't come with an understanding that participatory grant-making and shifting power also comes essentially with resourcing intermediary funders. So I believe to make this point clearer, we also need to look at the past. Red Umbrella Fund was launched 10 years ago in 2012. It's our 10th year anniversary this year. And it was born after conversations with funders and representatives from sex worker-led organizations that decided that there was a need for a global fund for and by sex workers, so that sex worker-led organizations could apply for core general funding according to their needs and not have their needs directed by funders. We are affected by HIV, but we're not just HIV. We're not just violence. And more traditional funders did not have the infrastructures in place to give to organizations that cannot register, because we are criminalized in most parts of the world, or to people that don't use their legal names all the time, that may use different names. And now, as Natasha said, there's a growing interest in participatory grant making. So 2 years ago, there were about 60 people in the community of practice. Natasha, you said we're now 903 people. And many big funders, if we don't use the word traditional funders, affirm their wish to shift power. And there's been some great examples. Mama Cash, the host organization of Red Umbrella Fund, the oldest global feminist fund in the world, has implemented participatory grant making practices, learning from Red Umbrella Fund as well. However, some of the funders that are interested in participatory grant makings, when there are questions, come up with answers that I find unsatisfying. So when I ask them, great, you want to introduce participatory grant making mechanisms, how will you make sure that sex workers can be included? Will you be able to fund unregistered organization? Will you not be able to require legal names? And the answer is often no. So there is more work that could be done on the own limitations of traditional funders before looking at shifting power, and resourcing intermediary community-led funders is a way to participate in participatory grant making. This is all despite research, including from funders concerned about AIDS, on community-rooted funders, showing that private and public donors all understand and share the opinion that community-rooted funders are best placed to respond to communities' needs. I also think funders, bigger funders, could be more proud of how they resource intermediary community-led funders. And we could do better at showing that relationship and that pride and that shifting of power. But in the meantime, whilst these conversations take place, the sex worker community struggles, loses battles, and still represented less than 1% of all shares of foundation human rights funding in 2018. Additionally, according to funders concerned about AIDS, still funders for intermediary funders, remained at a limited 6% of all HIV-related philanthropic funding, just to take that one. And only 1 to 2% of all HIV-related grants went to an intermediary funders. The second point that is challenging in fundraising for a participatory global sex worker-led fund is stigma and discrimination. It exists everywhere in society, including in philanthropy. And tensions can arise when you fundraise for a criminalized community. Traditional funders, when they shift funding, are more likely to shift funding and power to a general population, general women, general LGBT people, but much less to sex workers, trans people, or people who use drugs. And in 2022, there is the International Trans Fund that works really hard for trans people around the world. There is Red Umbrella Fund, but there is still no global fund for and by people who use drugs. Funders are also not necessarily holistic, and that leads to exclusion, because when a women fund say they include all women, research has shown that women-led sex worker-led organizations will not see that funding trickling down to them. And that applies to LGBT funders as well. That applies to labor rights funders. Again, sex workers, we're not just one thing. We're workers, we're people, etc. And in the meantime, whilst we have this conversation in 2018, sex workers, I'll take HIV examples again, accounted for 6% of all new HIV infections globally. Their clients, as well as sexual partners and other key populations, account for another 18% of new infections. And yet programs for sex workers received only 0.6% of all HIV expenditure, according to a report done by AIDS funds. Funders concerned about AIDS 2019 resource tracking report also highlighted that sex workers, like almost all other key populations, the populations particularly affected by HIV and AIDS and criminalized, experienced an 11% decline in HIV philanthropic funding in 2019 compared to 2018. The third challenge that I wanted to mention today was the lack of long-term core flexible funding. We've touched upon it a little bit. As an intermediary funder, we can only resource the movement as we are resourced ourselves. We receive grants because we're part of philanthropy and we have to play the game of philanthropy that are 1 or 2 years. And that leads to very difficult situations. I said that the funding for Red Umbrella Fund was good this year, and it was good last year. We've been doing better. But if I look at 2024, only 50% of the funding is secured for a budget that is lower than this year. At 2025, only 16% of the funding is secured, again with a budget smaller than this year. How can we hope to grow? How can we hope to have another staff member so that we can do more grants when we don't have that visibility and we rely on 1 to 2 years grant? And the question was about how we mitigate this, and I'll be very brief on that. The way we mitigate this is by, it's very linked to what you said, Sadaf, showing our value, showing our work, showing who we are from the beginning, trying to show the contradictions that we see in the field, and we expect the same from others. If we have contradictions, we want to hear and learn from them. And that's part of the work that we do to mitigate these challenges, and that's why I was here today to speak about those.
Thanks, Paul-Gilbert. I really echo what you say, that funders that are funding this work and are doing it need to be louder and prouder about it and be advocating for others to be doing the same. Thank you so much. And then last is my colleague Yodit, who I get the privilege of discussing these matters with very often. So welcome to the Camden Giving sofa a little bit, and I'll hand over to Yodit.
Thanks, Asha. Really happy to be here and hear others about this topic. I am going to share my screen now. I'm a visual learner, so I'm going to start by playing a video about who Camden Giving are and what we stand for, and hopefully we'll have no tech issues here. I don't see a play button, Natasha. I might need George and Leonard to interject.
I can find it on YouTube.
Sorry. You got it, or I can just play it now. Got it on YouTube.
Go on, you go for it.
Yeah. So I am, hi everyone, I'm Yodit. I work at Camden Giving. Been at Camden Giving for 10 months, and I am the partnership manager at Camden Giving. That was just an ad that you heard in the background, but I'm just going to share that video now about what Camden Giving stands for.
Our mission is to end local. Camden Giving is a different kind of charity. Our mission is to end local poverty and inequality in Camden, and we do that by empowering the local community to decide how to spend the money we raise. Camden has the second widest wealth gap in the country. People with money living side by side to people who are struggling, and not having enough money makes it more likely that you'll have poor health, an increased risk of knife violence, and less power to change things around you. We believe there needs to be a better way of creating equality in communities. So together with our supporters, communities, and the charities we fund, we are shifting the power within Camden. We are a participatory funder. This means the people we want to help, people in Camden experiencing poverty, homelessness, violence, or inequality, are the same people who should decide which charities get funding from Camden Giving. We recruit people experiencing inequality in Camden, provide them with support and training, and pay them for the important work that they are doing. They form community panels who decide which charities should receive grants from Camden Giving. It means that charities who have the best solutions to local issues receive more funding, regardless of how good their fundraising campaigns are. Our community panels give grants to a wide range of local charities, like boxing clubs for at-risk young people, social clubs for isolated older people, and night shelters for people who are homeless. The people and businesses who give to Camden Giving do so because they want to give power to people who are experiencing inequality, either because of disability, racial injustice, gender, or personal circumstances. The money they give has a greater impact because it is spent by people with a deep understanding of issues their communities face. Camden Giving, working together for a better Camden.
Hopefully I'm back now. But so today,
all the fun of the tech drama, Yodit.
No, now I know why the other speakers have probably just chosen not to do a presentation. So yeah, I've decided to focus on the tensions of fundraising as a Black fundraiser in participatory grantmaking. And just a side note, I'm not claiming to speak on behalf of every Black fundraiser on the planet, but it's something that while I've been at Camden Giving, it's not something that I've heard people talk about. And I love having uncomfortable conversations. So this is the topic that I want to discuss. And in this presentation, I will tell you a bit about the tensions that I've experienced, and then why I think it's important to discuss. So what tensions do come up as a Black fundraiser in participatory grantmaking? I have sadly felt after a few donor meetings that I am the only person in the room that looks like me. And these are I just thought I would share some of the thoughts that I have before I go to a meeting or after I leave a meeting. So a question that I've had that's come up in my head is, can a Black fundraiser be as successful as a white fundraiser? I've heard a colleague say that a donor has said that they trust, and this is a white colleague that said that the donors said that they trust her with the money. What they meant by that is still unknown, but that is what made me think about if Black fundraisers can be successful in PGM. Another thought is, will I be the only Black person in the room? Am I talking too much about race? Do I have to keep talking about my experience, whether that's racism or inequality that I might have faced? And does my white colleague have to do the same to convince that donor to join the partnership? Will there be hostility if I discuss our anti-racist strategy, which Camden Giving are developing, and I encourage you to check out on our website. So yeah, and I guess these tensions come up more, or I'm more aware of it, because at Camden Giving, I'm very proud that my colleagues, we represent the community. Our trustee boards is diverse, and I'm very proud of that also. I used to manage Camden Giving's social media, and I'm always conscious that I try and avoid over-representing a community just to convince a donor to support our cause. So yeah, there's some of the tensions that I feel as a Black fundraiser. And now I will share why I think it's important to discuss. I'm sure why I love participatory grantmaking, and I'm sure everyone in this room feels the same, is that the model is looking to shift decisions. And if I'm sure others in this meeting have used the pitch to encourage others to support this journey of PGM, is that traditional models of how charity frameworks have traditionally been have they been working if we still are seeing inequalities in the world. And I would hate for, in 30 years' time, for participatory grant making to have the same issue as traditional models if we are just putting a plaster on inequalities and we're not actually getting to the root of it and shifting power and doing all the fabulous things that we aim to do. And I guess this brings up the question of if me as a Black fundraiser, who, I don't want to use the word begging, but how does it look if me as a Black fundraiser has to keep going around and speaking to white donors, asking them for money? Is this funding, if we are accepting this money, is this funding undermining our values and our mission at Camden Giving and at your charity? How much power does our donors really letting go of? That is why I think this topic is important. And I guess I want people to think about, can participatory grant making change the world, or is it going to just facilitate systematic issues? Another reason why I think it's important to discuss is obviously staff's mental health. I would hope to see more Black fundraisers. And I'm sure this is just from my experience in London, I haven't come across too many. And then when I've asked, the names have come up. So I guess that's just for me to research, but I'd love to be in a room where we can all share our experiences. But there's a survey that the Independent newspaper done, I think it was last year, that said that Black employees are leaving jobs due to lack of diversity. And I know that this discussion was focusing on participatory grant making. It's not just this industry that will be dealing with finding it hard to recruit people, but I just want to offer a different perspective to this discussion, so that if you work with someone that is Black, that you are able to offer some support and just be aware of another perspective and how others might be feeling in your team. So to end, I will bring up a quote that I think is quite fitting to this, to what I've just shared. So Martin Luther King said, "The problems of radical injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power." I found it quite hard to come up with solutions about what I've shared. Of course, I've got a really great relationship with my colleagues where I'm able to discuss such matters, and I would hope that other Black fundraisers have that same safe space. And the main takeaway is just to have this perspective in mind, if it wasn't already. And to answer my question earlier about, can Black fundraisers be as successful as white fundraisers? I believe so, and I hope, that many in this room do also. But I just wanted, my advice or solution would be to have these conversations more, so that we can all learn from each other and grow as a community. And yeah, that's, if we have time for questions, I would be happy to talk more, but I think I'll pass back to Natasha and Jelena now.
Thanks, Yodit. I think, like, I'm sure everyone in this room has laid awake at some point and worried that, like, feeling of what if we are just facilitating this system that's not working. We've got 15 minutes. Does anyone have any questions they want to unmute themselves or put them in the chat? I'd be really grateful for questions that are questions, not statements. And if you are directing them to Yodit or Paul-Gilbert or Sadaf, can you let me know as well, please? The floor is yours. Oh, thanks, Paul-Gilbert. Yodit, do you want to take the Camden Giving question? There's a question from Lisa Scala. I apologise if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. I'm wondering about the balance between projects being chosen being charity-based or more social change-based.
Yeah, I saw that question. I'm not sure if I understand it. If you could.
I'm happy to clarify. Thank you. But first of all, Yodit, also thank you, and Paul-Gilbert, for really kind of approaching this with your personal story. Has really given me some things to think about and to keep checking myself as well and those that are around me of how to really move towards equity in your spaces. Thank you. So my question around this participatory grant making, and in Camden, you said that your organization really reflects citizens in your community, but they ultimately decide what projects should be used. In the video, I saw like a food bank and, you know, things like that. How do you work? I mean, if all of the projects that are chosen are like for direct needs like food, shelter, housing, is that fair game? Do you work at all with the community on, you know, what do we want for longer term goals? How do we get there? And now let's see the projects. Like, how does that work?
Sure. Okay. So at Camden Giving, we have 3 funds. And each fund have different community panels. So a fund that we have open that awards a grant of £10,000 is to youth services. We recruit young people aged 16 to 25 to decide what is important to them, and then they put out to charities and organisations in Camden about what they want to see happen in Camden, and then those that provide that service will apply. And then we have like smaller grant called We Make Camden Kit Fund that awards people that want to make our borough better. So it's also great to have that for those that have never had the chance to start a project and see how it goes. And then there's obviously the people that are already serving in the community that to grow with the larger grants. And yeah, I guess to answer your question, and then we've got funds that, say, where with the COVID, during lockdown, we have a COVID fund open. So that was more of an immediate need. But yeah, the different ages and and it's nice to have the panel always, they don't all agree. Everyone's got different opinions. And it's nice that they they can all come to a decision at the end, but then our grants team will be there to facilitate that. They don't give their opinion about who they think they should fund, but they are there to do like the due diligence and make sure that everyone in that room is happy with the final decision. I hope I've answered that. I hope that answered your question.
Thanks, Yodit. Isetta had her hand up, and then there's a couple in the chat. Isetta, I'll come to you if that's all right.
Thank you, Natasha, and sorry. Thank you, Sadaf, Paul-Gilbert, and Yodit for the presentations. They're really wonderful. And I think for me, I'm coming more seeking an advice, because everything you said really resonates, and I feel I've had similar experiences. So I'm a program director for adolescent girls and young people. And so I realized, I'm sorry, my kids just got home. But I realized that as
People can relate with the kids.
I've got unexpected kids running around as well.
So sorry. Yeah.
Don't apologize.
What do I do? Yeah. So I struggle actually raising funds for the program, because although there's so much interest in girls and young people, but then the same as other marginalized communities, I feel like there's a lot of how can I say, like, there's a lot of marketing around supporting girls, for instance, but then when it comes to actually practically giving funds, I realize that it's complicated. And so yeah, any advice, and I know you mentioned Paul-Gilbert, just you shared a few strategies, but I would really love to know, because I struggle even internally with my own team to get the buy-in and the enthusiasm, so that there's more efforts being made to fundraise. So anyways, I would really love that. And then also just to Yodit, so I'm a program director, but then I experience the same bias and the same issues when I meet with donors, because I try to raise funds, but immediately their assumption is that, oh, I'm from the global south, then so there's so much tensions that even as program staff, I feel it really exists. So anyways, if you've any advice as well in that area would be great, especially given that I am interested in moving more towards the fundraising field. Sorry, a lot of advice seeking.
So maybe two questions they said. So one on sort of how do you get buy-in internally for increased fundraising? Sadaf, I know that I don't feel you are a participatory grant maker, but I know you're sort of beating the drum for moving in that direction. So I don't know if you mind taking that question of what you're doing.
As in internally at Firelight?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if this will exactly answer your question, Isetta, but I think we've moved towards all of us being constantly taking the role of being ambassadors, advocates for, bluntly, getting money to communities. And we sort of view it as if we can play that role to channel those funds in ways that are enabling, not restrictive, not harmful, not extractive. And so we don't actually have an in-house grant writer or an in-house communications person, which has been a big challenge, which is something that we're thinking of, a gap we're thinking to fill. But in the meantime, each of us plays that role. So we are constantly doing a lot of donor dialogue, education, advocacy, because we operate in this role as an intermediary, like Paul-Gilbert was describing. We find ourselves having access to funder spaces. So there'll be a funder network on like the International Education Funders Group, or funders who are supporting children's rights. So we find ourselves in these spaces, and we do a lot of advocacy in education. We'll do webinars on shifting power. We'll do one-on-one conversations with different funders, even if we're not soliciting funding from them. We're not, but we're trying to change their understanding. And I think one of the core pieces that's helped us in these conversations is a real uncomfortable conversation about charity versus solidarity, and really getting people to unpack, why do they do the work they do, and who is it about, and who is it really keeping the power with, and do they really want to see people get out of poverty, or not need them anymore? And if that is true, genuinely what you want to do, then are your current practices enabling that, or actually sustaining the status quo? And oftentimes, that's just a starting point for a conversation, but we do see more shifts happen when you frame it in those terms and challenge people to unpack, what does charity do? Who is charity about? Who does charity keep the power with? What are the norms, like, this expectation of gratitude and, groveling in appreciation to the giver, but maintaining that inequity, maintaining that hierarchy, and that if we truly, as we claim to want to move towards a world that is socially just, then is charity ever going to get us there? It's fundamentally not meant to get us there. And so then is this other approach of taking a solidarity approach. And so that's where we start seeing a little bit of like, that, there's a little bit of movement inside people's hearts and minds. But it's an ongoing process, both in our team, with our partners, also the community grantees as well, for them to shift to being able to demand what they need rather than just, sort of accepting what funders give them. And then of course, among funders themselves, to be able to shift who the role they play in the sector.
I feel like I'm creating great injustice. There's not more space for conversation. Was the second sort of part of the question kind of, what are your tips for surviving fundraiser in rooms where you feel discriminated against? I don't know if there are. Has anyone found the magic bullet, or even a slightly helpful bullet?
I mean, my advice to myself, I can share with you, is I came from a sales background before I started working at Camden Giving, so I'm used to no's. Just try not to take it personally, and just speak to your colleagues. It's better to don't let it build up in your head, these feelings, and just try. I mean, for me, I would try and find a community of other Black fundraisers, and we can share. And then also just having the opportunity to speak in this room about this is also great. But yeah, I mean, my advice, yeah, I don't. Yeah, you'll love it. It's a fundraising part more so than the tensions. And I would just say maybe I think advice is try and look at whoever you're going to have a meeting with what do they have on their website, the business? Are they supporting, I don't know, Black Lives Matter? Are they talking about having more diversity in their team, or is it just not acknowledged at all? And then I guess a wider conversation is, are we okay just accepting money from just anyone? But that would be your charity's decision. But can I go back to your first question? My advice would be to get out the office and just for your team that aren't as passionate into your work. I know when I visit some of our grantees, local people just doing amazing things, it motivates me to fundraise, and it reminds me why I'm asking for money. So yeah, just projects.
Paul-Gilbert, you've got a 1 minute point, I hope.
Yes, I think we have a slightly helpful bullet for this one on how to survive/navigate philanthropy with all its contradictions and its stigma. Because I'm very lucky to work for a sex worker-led fund, that means most of my team have sex work experience as well. And what we say to each other is treat donors like clients. We seduce them, we have the words, we have why we're here, we have reasons why we were created. And we agree on a service. And if we're not willing to do a service, we're not willing to do that service. The relationship ends there. And I also wanted to go back very, very quickly on how to do the fundraising by ourselves. Because we're so small, we can't. Relying on others, telling others to say, if there's no mention of sex workers, can you do that? Because you realize we're 3.5 staff, is very helpful. And once we find these people who have access to organizations that will not listen to us because we're sex worker led, that is very, very helpful.
What a note to end on. Thank you so much. I've found this so interesting. If other people have as well, I wonder if it's useful to have a breakaway conversation about it. I'm so sorry that there are questions in the chat that haven't been answered. If you're not in the Slack channel, join the Slack channel and put them in there, and we can talk about this all day and all night. I was meant to share a slide about feedback. If you have feedback like that I should be better at timekeeping, there's a feedback form on the PGM community of practice. Massive, massive thanks to Sadaf, Paul-Gilbert, Yodit, and to Elena and Millie for doing all of the things that no one sees but make us function. Thank you so much for joining. Over and out.
Thank you.